Hi everyone, welcome to this paper. It's an autobiographical exploration of how anti-blackness continues to dominate or frame who is allowed to speak, write and produce on racial enslavement in Britain. It was presented as part of the University of Northampton's Race and Leadership Conference as well this year. Based in autoethnography, it's grounded in Black feminist storytelling traditions. Growing up, there was a disproportionately high level of women in my family, and so that's where I learned it all. My mum, my grandma, my auntie, my late auntie Louisa, grandma's friends, and my mum's friends who told stories about old Northamptonshire and gave an entry into their lives through what Moya Bailey later coined as misogynoir in 2008. My family background of island women, so Caribbean women, and homegrown teaching of intersectional struggle came easier when finding folks on the same wavelength as me at university and also post-university. Who do I think with and learn from? And many people I do that work with now, including through WhatsApp chats, are Black and other women of colour, and very thoughtful, thinky individuals, where I found also being autistic ADHD while Black. It's nearly always women that are more likely to give grace over disability than men, whose place in the patriarchy can often stop us giving ourselves grace for not being able to do and also produce labour. In 1998, US medical doctors introduced the term cultural humility to encourage white people not to enforce their expertise on other cultures in the medical field, but actually to stay in a permanent state of curiosity. This phenomenon of white expertise in Black healthcare settings in the 90s, for instance, can be repositioned to my experiences going to events, conferences, and really reading books published by UK publishers about racial enslavement. This also includes the documentaries that get produced as well. The late historian and critical race theorist Charles W. Mills argued in his book The Racial Contract, Today's Global West is built upon an agreement between white folks to uphold white supremacy that exploits Black, brown, and others not racialized as white and their resources. The racial contract understands that white racism to be a product of a set of circumstances, and that whiteness, as he calls it, should be the focus of our analysis. Mills states that there are other racial contracts that do exist, that do not involve white/non-white power struggles, but it's possible to decolorize whiteness from the big W to the small w, and that could also be thought of, and I quote here, as demonstrating that in a parallel universe, it could have been a yellow, red, brown, or Black whiteness. Whiteness is not really a colour at all, but a set of power relations. Mills gets me to think about how British documentaries, databases, and scholarly books that get produced about the nation's histories of racial enslavement are in a similar white/Black power struggle and are not, in fact, Black sources, but really what non-Black people, groups, and institutions are saying about the violence that happened to us. I use the example of the Legacies of British Slavery database that was published at the same time as the book Legacies of British Slave Ownership, Colonial Slavery and the Formation of Victorian Britain, which has been useful for my work on the ways empire and colonial violence is excluded from UK Regency period dramas. The book in question uses incredibly clinical and statistical language which reflects its sources, drawing heavily from archives, but this can distance readers from the violence committed against Black humans on plantations in the Caribbean. The historians who wrote that book and made the accompanying database were white, and while it documents how wealth flowed into British families and institutions from the Caribbean, it is not delicate in how it talks about us. Cedric Robinson popularised the term racial capitalism, arguing that racism and capitalism are entwined, dependent on racial hierarchies, violences like genocide, and inequalities like labour exploitation, land theft, and forms of dispossession such as systemic financial exclusion and redlining. LBS typically ignores the genocides required for institutions in the present to thrive. Although the database is useful as a historical record, its lack of debate of the debate of violence to uphold those records left me wanting more. It reminds me how many Imperial historians are not trained to think social scientifically, where you can find many criminologists willing to talk about violence. By focusing on the compensation of individuals, inheritance structures, and identifiable recipients, LBS fundamentally sidesteps the instinctive sexual, economic, material, and psychic nature of anti-Black racism in the minds of those who were compensated, which is what made all this possible. Archives often extract emotion from these histories, and from this perspective, the LBS and its book are symbolic of the approach many British imperial historians take in uncovering the past. For universities, it's much easier to focus on alleged benevolent enslavers while ignoring how these were also anti-Black individuals who contributed to the institutionalizing and structuralizing of anti-Blackness as we see it today. So to give words to this experience of seeing non-Black, but mainly the ways whiteness upholds the production of imperial history in the UK, I wrote a Substack article where I introduced the term academic race play, which was coined in conversation with historian and literary scholar Dr. Kerry Sinanan, and then discussed further in a symposium, which hopefully at some point I'll be able to put the link in the description, with historian Dr. Daisha Osborne earlier on this year. It came from my experiences watching white scholars at academic conferences, university symposiums, community events, and public literary festivals. This is a term I came to use to describe when non-Black, but mainly white, so-called experts, positioned in white proximity, use Black people, but especially Black women's bodies and ideas to legitimize their work while excluding really Black voices from career opportunities, especially Black women. And this includes keynote lecture opportunities, conference panels, being positioned as support at events like literary festivals, while the non-Black leads are not actually in conversation with the communities that they're talking about. You get to see who is licensed to speak are not only those trying to dismantle the system, but those actively participating in direct epistemic violence, so there's violence done through knowledge production. So in these texts, there's rarely a debate over positionality, and it feels often they get into this topic, for lack of a better word, clout. That license to speak is something I see on conference panels a lot, where Black women get excluded, but you will have white men, white women, and Black men to talk about things like race, racism, and empire. I see this in Black history spaces, anti-racism spaces, and recently I was signposted to another example at the Music as Black Festival at V&A East. But in a place like Black British music, you'd expect this was somewhere where academic race play wouldn't be apparent, but it was. It speaks to the ways events are managed and who is allowed to speak. Similarly, I look at the ways music festivals do this race play of Black knowledge production, which includes Milton Keynes' Reggaeland, which is run and organised by white men attached to histories of sound system as a cultural institution that in the British context came with Caribbean people, but especially Jamaican men. Michelle Rolfe Trio further says we are all amateur historians with various degrees of awareness about our production, learning history from similar amateurs. Universities and university presses are not the only producers of this historical narrative. Most Europeans and North Americans learn their history through media that has not been subjected to the rules or the standards set by higher education. And long before non-academics read the historians who set the standards for colleagues and students, they access history through celebrations like site and museum visits, movies, national holidays, and primary school books. So academic race play does not end with white people, but really into spaces where whiteness can be upheld, which also includes people that look just like me. Especially for Black men, I find there is often a want to be accepted, and in that way you can find Black men in cases may choose to align themselves with the white male patriarchy over Blackness, so instead of aligning themselves with Black women and solidarity, who will never really be accepted at the top of the dining club. In her essay, Sexism and American Disease in Blackface, from her book Sister Outsider, poet and Black feminist critic Audre Lorde tells us that Black women and Black men cannot begin to dialogue by denying the oppressive nature of male privilege. If Black men choose to lean into our privilege for whatever reason, including the misogynistic raping and terrorizing of Black women, then ignoring the ways Black men's oppression harms Black women only serves those controlling this oppression. She famously writes that one oppression does not justify another. In The Will to Change, bell hooks continues to say that black men are trapped within a violent system of imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, and how enslaved black men were taught by white people to endeavor to become caring patriarchs or benevolent patriarchs to gain freedom and provide and protect black women, exercising power without force. It was this form of patriarchy that Hooke says black men coming from the plantation were taught to imitate. However, many took up the dominator model practiced by the white male masters, using violence to dominate black women as a repetition of the enslaver. So this logic comes through in academia, and this race play, where the promise of inclusion into the patriarchal order is probably part of what splits some black men from allying themselves with black women in academic spaces, no less than in thinking about the ways black women are excluded from imperial history panels, events, and frequently having to race play with black men and non-black people as well. In the male world, it can be about status and symbols, the best house, the best car, physique, etc. And when you don't have that, lots of men then start feeling sidelined. It's about performance for other men, and UK academia can be one of those sites where that status, to some extent, comes full circle. Assimilation into what Hooke calls imperialists, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy might be part of what allows non-black imperial historians to discuss racial enslavement without having to talk about the specifics, not having to talk about how whiteness works, much in similar ways to those of colour who want a career in the public eye. In 2023, I wrote a long read for anti-capitalist scene The Commoner called Big Trees, Small Acts: Does the UK Honour System Divide and Rule Black British Media? I argued that assimilation into colonial systems is a precondition for black people to have a greater chance of having a successful public media career. The historian and broadcaster David Olusoga had earlier been given a primetime slot for the coronation and was swept up in a Twitter controversy, reacting to the British journalist Amanda Platel's tweet that questioned why the BBC gave him her top spot. And she also claimed he called the monarchy institutionally racist in the Netflix series Harry and Meghan, which he didn't, but he began to dispute her claims, although it wasn't a clinically false statement. The monarchy is a racist institution. Why would anyone argue against that? What followed were numbers of criticisms from black tweeters, including numbers from the academic and non-academic world, where he then subsequently blocked them after they challenged him. We don't necessarily have to look far to see the ways black scholars are played off against each other in academia, nor the ways black British history education from the BBC, no less, as an authority, plays fast and loose with what colonialism was. Admittedly, I find Olusoga's documentaries quite entertaining, and he is very good at storytelling with that media training, but they ultimately serve the powerful because he does not challenge anything. In 2025, his latest documentary, Empire, gave a history of the British Empire without a conversation about whiteness, white supremacy, and its associated evils. He uses wars to describe genocides and revolutions to describe economic violence built on the backs of the global majority, and it's a documentary about empire that fails to analyse the anti-blackness that empire was built on, whilst we're living in the time that treats today's Palestinian statehood as controversially split from debates about histories of colonialism, whiteness, and white supremacy as histories of the present. So, David Olusoga's books and documentaries are symbolic then for what seems to go on at conferences, in other imperial history publications, and what have you, where British historians are able to write about the history that my ancestors endured without the language of white supremacy, anti-blackness, and genocide. It's extremely grating to see the ways historians talk about racial slavery in public because it speaks to an academic training that splits what happened in the past from what institutions and institutional behaviours develop. Reading these books, it's clear how many historians only seem to talk to others like them, evidenced in who gets cited and celebrated. And while disciplines like sociology and criminology are not perfect, I know that in talking to sociologists and criminologists, there's less of a question on if early Black death during and as a consequence of racial slavery was in fact genocide. The willingness to look beyond their discipline is there too. Um, So the willingness to look beyond their discipline is there too, where reading social scientists, so many can write historically, which is not always the case when it comes to UK-based historians being able to think in systems as racial slavery was a system as much as a historical event. Engaging with British imperial history, I end up having to look to what scholars in the US, Canada, and the Caribbean are saying because it is often more critical and offers a more emotional take rather than the quote-unquote objective take. I think that happens in the UK. I think to books like In the Wake by Christina Sharp that argues early Black death is a necessity for white supremacy to sustain itself. Thinking back to the Legacies of British Slavery database, a critical race discussion may argue that white supremacist violence is the mode through which British institutions live, but academic race play is a way of thinking how the system incentivizes us to invest in whiteness and not ask critical questions about it. And that's the end of my paper, and thanks very much for listening. And again, if you had any questions or comments as well, leave them in the comment section or send me an email at treyventour.com/contact.